In the early decades of the 20th century, America was changing at a pace few could have imagined. Cities were booming, factories were rising, and the promise of steady work drew people from all directions. East St. Louis, a bustling industrial hub along the Mississippi River, became one of those places where opportunity seemed endless. Its factories roared day and night, producing the goods that fueled the nation's growth. To many, it appeared as though this city held the key to a better life. For African American families living in the rural South, this promise shone particularly bright. Life under oppressive laws and limited opportunities pushed countless individuals to seek a new beginning. They packed their belongings, boarded trains, and traveled northward, drawn by the hope of stable jobs and the chance to carve out a more secure future. East St. Louis was one of the destinations where dreams seemed within reach. As these families arrived, they found work in industries that desperately needed labor. The city's factories, railroads, and stockyards were eager to employ anyone willing to work long hours for modest wages. For the newcomers, it was a step forward, a chance to earn enough to support their loved ones and escape the harshest realities of life back home. Their determination and resilience fueled their ambition, and slowly, black neighborhoods began to take shape within the city. But while opportunity blossomed for some, it stirred unease in others. Many white workers, who had long held a foothold in the industrial economy, began to feel threatened. They saw the arrival of black laborers as direct competition, men and women willing to accept lower wages in exchange for a chance at steady work. In the tense atmosphere of labor disputes and strikes, resentment grew. Whispers spread in union halls, on street corners, and inside the factories themselves. What had once seemed like a distant concern was now at their doorstep, and fear of economic displacement mixed dangerously with long-standing prejudice. This fragile balance set the stage for one of the most tragic episodes in American history. What began as a story of migration and hope would soon transform into a tale of deep conflict, revealing how the pursuit of opportunity could collide with the forces of fear and hostility. The city that had once symbolized growth and progress would soon be scarred by events that exposed the painful divisions within American society. The story of East St. Louis is not just about a single city or a single moment in time. It reflects the struggles faced by countless people searching for dignity, fairness, and the chance to provide for their families. It is a reminder of how fragile peace can be when communities are divided, and how quickly resentment can ignite into something far more destructive. If you find this story meaningful and want to continue exploring hidden chapters of history together, don't forget to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share it with others who care about uncovering the past. Your support helps bring these stories to life. Until then, stay curious and stay inspired. In the early years of the 20th century, East St. Louis stood as a city of steel and smoke, where the rumble of factories echoed through the streets and the promise of steady wages drew thousands into its orbit. Yet beneath the noise of progress lay another sound, quieter but no less powerful, the murmur of unease spreading among white labor unions. For generations, these unions had fought to protect their members from exploitation. They bargained for better hours, safer conditions, and wages that could sustain a family. Their identity and pride were bound to the idea that they had carved out their place in the industrial world through hard work and unity. But that unity was fragile, and it was about to be tested. When African American families began arriving from the South, their journey was one of hope. They sought escape from oppression and a chance at fairer treatment. To them, East St. Louis was not just another city, it was an opening into a different kind of life. With determination, they stepped into roles that factories readily offered, filling gaps left during strikes or shortages, and bringing with them a willingness to endure long hours in harsh conditions. For white workers, however, these changes felt like a storm gathering on the horizon. They feared that employers, ever eager to cut costs, might prefer the newcomers who were willing to work for less. To many union men, this wasn't just about wages, it was about survival in an economy that seemed to grow more unstable with every passing year. They worried that the sacrifices they had made, the strikes they had endured, and the solidarity they had built could be swept away by a workforce eager to take the very jobs they considered their own. In meeting halls and union gatherings, this fear was voiced in heated tones. Leaders warned of the danger, insisting that their members stand guard against losing their hard-won positions. Flyers circulated, conversations darkened, and suspicion grew. The arrival of new workers was no longer seen as a natural part of the city's growth but as a direct threat to the livelihoods of men who had believed their place secure. This fear was not confined to numbers on a paycheck. It seeped into the daily rhythm of life. On the factory floor, glances turned cold. On the streets, tension lingered in the air. The white workers who had once spoken of solidarity began to draw invisible lines, deciding who belonged within their circle and who stood outside it. The very idea of unity, the strength that unions had once relied upon, fractured under the weight of these divisions. Employers, too, recognized the tension and in some cases used it to their advantage. By playing groups against each other, they could weaken the power of strikes and undermine collective bargaining. Where workers might once have stood shoulder to shoulder, now they found themselves caught in suspicion, their anger directed not toward management but toward one another. And so, what began as whispers of competition slowly grew into a roar of resentment. White laborers began to view the presence of black workers not as the pursuit of opportunity, but as an intrusion. The economic anxiety of the moment merged with deeper prejudices, fueling a hostility that was both personal and collective. In the homes of white union members, conversations echoed the same concern: how could their families endure if their wages fell? What future awaited their children if jobs slipped away? Fear hardened into resentment, and resentment began to shape action. The bonds of labor solidarity gave way to division, creating a powder keg of emotions waiting for the smallest spark. The story of East St. Louis in this moment was no longer just about industrial growth or migration. It became a struggle over identity and belonging, about who had the right to claim a piece of the city's prosperity. The labor unions, once symbols of unity, became reflections of division, revealing the complexity of a society where economic insecurity and prejudice intertwined. Looking back, one can see how these fears were both real and manipulated, how the desire to protect one's livelihood was twisted into hostility toward those seeking the same dream. The men who gathered in union halls believed they were defending their way of life, yet in doing so, they deepened the rift that would tear through the city. This chapter reminds us that fear of displacement, if left unchecked, can grow into something far larger than wages and contracts. It can reshape communities, fracture trust, and lead to consequences that echo for generations. East St. Louis was a city built on the promise of industry, but in the shadows of that promise lay tensions that revealed just how fragile progress could be when unity gave way to division. The summer of 1917 was stifling in East St. Louis. Heat pressed down on the crowded streets, and the air itself seemed heavy with the noise of factories, the shouts of street vendors, and the restless energy of a city swelling beyond its limits. Beneath that surface bustle, however, unease simmered. Workers eyed one another with suspicion, neighborhoods remained divided, and rumors moved faster than truth could ever hope to catch up. It was in this tense atmosphere that whispers began to circulate, quiet at first, then louder, until they echoed in taverns, on street corners, and in factory yards. The story was simple, gripping, and dangerous. A black man had supposedly taken the life of a white man. There was no proof, no record, not even a reliable witness, yet the rumor spread with the urgency of wildfire carried on a dry wind. For many in the city, the details did not matter. The climate was already charged with resentment, and the rumor gave shape to fears that had been growing unchecked. People who heard it rarely questioned whether it was true; instead, they leaned into the emotions it stirred. Each retelling added weight, and soon the story was no longer a whisper but a conviction, treated as fact by those already primed to believe the worst. In working-class neighborhoods, the rumor stirred anger. Men muttered that something had to be done, that this was a sign of what they had feared all along. Mothers called their children inside earlier than usual, sensing the danger that hung in the air. The city, alive with movement during the day, seemed cloaked in tension when night fell. Every shadow felt heavier, every sound sharper. What made the rumor so potent was not its content but the timing. Only weeks before, strikes and protests had highlighted the divisions between labor groups. Factories had employed new workers to fill gaps, and resentment had grown among those who saw their jobs at risk. The atmosphere was already unstable, all it needed was a spark. The false story became that spark, igniting suspicion into anger and turning anger into action. The local press, instead of extinguishing the flames with facts, often fueled them with sensational headlines and careless words. Stories were printed without full verification, framing the city as a place on the brink of chaos. Readers consumed these accounts with both fascination and fear, rarely pausing to ask whether the stories were true. The line between reality and rumor blurred, and with each passing day the falsehood gained strength. In homes across East St. Louis, conversations grew darker. Fathers warned their sons to be ready for trouble. Neighbors exchanged uneasy glances, wondering what the next night would bring. Tension thickened like a storm cloud, unseen but undeniable, ready to break at any moment. For the black families who had recently migrated to the city, the atmosphere turned ominous. They knew too well how quickly suspicion could shift into blame, and how blame could erupt into violence. Many urged one another to stay cautious, to avoid places where tempers were running hot. Yet no amount of caution could erase the unease that came from knowing a lie was spreading faster than truth. As July wore on, the rumor became less a story and more a rallying cry. Groups of men, fueled by anger and fear, began to gather. What had started as talk grew into action, as mobs organized under the belief that they were delivering justice. The absence of proof no longer mattered, conviction had replaced evidence, and rage had silenced reason. The tragic irony is that no crime had occurred in the way the story described. But by the time the truth could have surfaced, it was too late. Words had already transformed into weapons. Once unleashed, the rumor became unstoppable, and the city braced for what was to come. This moment reminds us of the dangerous power of misinformation. A single story, whispered without proof, can carry enough weight to shift the course of a community. When repeated often enough, it ceases to feel like rumor and takes on the shape of reality in the minds of those who believe it. In East St. Louis, that false story became the match that lit the fire, leaving scars that would mark the city for generations. The events of that July stand as a testament to how fragile peace can be when fear and anger overwhelm truth. The rumor of a crime that never happened became the spark for real violence, a sobering reminder that stories, whether true or false, can shape the destiny of an entire community. Nightfall in East St. Louis should have brought rest from the heat of the July sun. Instead, it marked the beginning of terror. As darkness crept over the city, groups of white men poured into the streets, their voices rising above the hum of summer insects. What began as scattered gatherings swelled into angry crowds, fueled by the rumors and resentments that had been festering for weeks. Their steps carried a single purpose: to descend upon the neighborhoods where black families lived, worked, and built their lives. The attacks did not come with warning. In one moment, families sat in their homes, children resting after long days, parents speaking quietly about hopes for the future. In the next, windows shattered under thrown rocks, and the glow of flames lit up the night sky. Businesses that had taken years to establish, modest homes built with savings scraped together penny by penny, suddenly all were marked for destruction. The mob swept through the streets with ruthless efficiency. Doors were broken down, belongings thrown into the street, and fires set with little hesitation. The crackle of burning wood filled the air, mixing with the desperate cries of families scrambling to escape. The firelight revealed faces twisted in anger and fear, neighbors who had once passed each other on the street now divided by suspicion and hatred. Children clung to their parents, rushed out into the night with only the clothes on their backs. Mothers carried infants while fathers tried desperately to shield their families from blows or flying debris. The safe spaces of ordinary life, kitchens, living rooms, and porches, were transformed into traps as fire spread from house to house. Entire blocks glowed orange against the dark sky, the smoke visible for miles beyond the city. Shops and businesses, the pride of a growing community, were not spared. Barbershops, cafes, and small groceries, each one representing years of perseverance, were torn apart in hours. These places had been more than businesses, they were gathering spots, cornerstones of a community striving to establish itself in a city that often pushed it to the margins. To see them reduced to rubble and ash was more than the loss of property, it was the tearing apart of a community's identity. What made the scene even more haunting was the indifference of those who might have intervened. The authorities, overwhelmed or unwilling, did little to stop the destruction. In some cases, their presence did not bring comfort but a chilling reminder that help would not come. Those targeted were left to fend for themselves, scattering into the night in search of safety. The violence was not random chaos. It carried with it a message, a cruel warning meant to drive families away, to erase the progress that had been made through hard work and resilience. Each burning home was intended to instill fear, to send a signal that success in the city would not be tolerated if it crossed the invisible boundaries drawn by prejudice and resentment. Survivors would later recall the terror of those nights, the sound of footsteps outside their doors, the smell of smoke creeping into their homes, the frantic decisions of whether to run or hide. Some escaped across the river, others found shelter with friends or strangers willing to risk offering help. But no one emerged untouched. Even those whose homes still stood carried scars, the memories of violence etched too deeply to fade. The devastation extended far beyond the flames. Entire families were displaced, their possessions destroyed, their sense of belonging shattered. Where once there had been thriving neighborhoods, there now lay ruins, blocks of charred timbers, broken glass, and smoldering ashes. The silence that followed the chaos was heavy, broken only by the distant crackle of fires still burning and the quiet sobs of those who had lost everything. For East St. Louis, the destruction was more than a momentary eruption of violence. It reshaped the city's landscape, scattering families who had once built their lives with care and determination. It sent a chilling reminder that progress was fragile, that dreams of safety and prosperity could be undone overnight. And it revealed the destructive power of fear and resentment, showing how quickly they could be transformed into actions that left permanent scars. The burning of homes and businesses was not simply an attack on buildings, it was an assault on hope itself. Yet even in the face of such devastation, survivors carried forward, determined to rebuild, to hold on to the dignity that the flames could not consume. Their resilience would become part of the story too, a quiet defiance against the destruction meant to erase them. That night in East St. Louis stands as a haunting reminder of how fragile communities can be when fear triumphs over humanity. The fires that burned were not only in the wooden frames of houses or the shelves of small shops, they were fires that consumed trust, leaving behind ruins both physical and emotional. The story of those attacks remains, not only as history but as a lesson in what happens when anger is left unchecked and when justice is absent in the face of cruelty. Numbers on a page can feel distant, cold, almost abstract. But behind every number, there was a life. When historians say that somewhere between 100 and 200 African Americans were murdered during the East St. Louis violence of 1917, it is not a statistic to glance over. It is a mass of human stories, each one torn from a family, each one leaving an absence that no record can ever fully capture. Imagine a neighborhood where children had once played in dusty yards, where fathers returned home from long shifts at the factories, and mothers tended to households with care and pride. Within days, those same streets were strewn with debris, and many of those voices were silenced forever. The uncertainty of the death toll reflects more than poor record-keeping, it reflects the chaos, the indifference, and in some cases, the deliberate erasure of what happened. Bodies were not all counted. Some were hidden by the Mississippi River, swept away in silence. Others were consumed by flames when homes were set alight. Still others were hastily buried in unmarked ground, leaving grieving families without even the dignity of a final farewell. Eyewitness accounts help us grasp the scale. Survivors spoke of men dragged into the open and beaten until they no longer moved. Women were struck down while trying to shield their children. Families who attempted to flee were hunted through the streets. Some victims were never identified, they became part of the shadowed tally of lives erased. To say, between 100 and 200, is to acknowledge the wide chasm between what was officially recorded and what truly occurred. The lower number represents what the authorities admitted. The higher number is what the survivors insisted, knowing in their hearts that far more were lost than officials would ever acknowledge. The uncertainty of those numbers also speaks to the silence that followed. When records are incomplete, when testimonies are minimized, when the truth is too uncomfortable for those in power to face, history itself becomes another casualty. Survivors told of neighbors who vanished overnight, never to return. Families whispered about loved ones who went missing, their absence explained only by the smoke and the gunfire that had filled the streets. These stories, handed down through generations, became the true record, even as official counts attempted to reduce the scale of the devastation. The impact of that number cannot be measured only in terms of the lives directly lost. For every person killed, there were parents, siblings, spouses, and children left behind. Their grief was compounded by fear that speaking out could bring further harm, fear that justice would never be served. For many, the trauma became a lifelong shadow. Children who witnessed the violence grew into adults marked by memories they could never escape. Families carried the pain into new cities when they fled, the unhealed wounds shaping how they lived for decades to come. Think of what was lost beyond the immediate lives, futures cut short, potential never realized. Among those who died were men and women who might have gone on to lead businesses, teach classrooms, create art, or raise families that would shape the future of the city. Their absence created a hole not only in their families but in the broader fabric of the community. The massacre robbed East St. Louis of generations of progress, silencing voices that might have carried the community forward. It is tempting to think of history in neat terms, names, dates, and figures lined up in a textbook. But when we look at the estimate of, between 100 and 200, we are reminded that history is messy, painful, and often obscured. The uncertainty itself tells a story of negligence, of denial, and of the ways entire tragedies can be brushed aside when they do not fit comfortably into the narrative of progress. Yet despite the efforts to minimize or forget, memory persisted. Survivors and their descendants continued to speak, even when the official record did not. Their testimonies make clear that the higher number is not exaggeration but truth pressing against silence. To them, the massacre was not an abstract event, it was the night their fathers, mothers, sisters, and children never came home. The devastation of East St. Louis reminds us that numbers are only the beginning. Behind 100 to 200 are voices, faces, and stories. It is the sound of a child calling for a parent who could not answer. It is the silence of an empty chair at the dinner table. It is the ripple of grief carried forward for generations. When we remember that uncertain tally today, it is not enough to see it as a figure from the past. We must recognize it as a call to acknowledge lives that were never properly honored, to ensure that the truth is not lost again in the margins of history. The true weight of those numbers lies not in the statistic but in the humanity it represents, and in the determination to never allow such silences to fall over tragedy again. The night sky over East St. Louis in July 1917 was filled with fire and smoke, but it was the sound that survivors remembered most, the shouts, the screams, the gunshots echoing through the streets. What unfolded in those hours was not just a riot, it was a deliberate campaign of terror that left families shattered and a community devastated. The violence came in waves. In some places, men with rifles prowled the streets, firing at anyone they saw. A worker returning home from a long shift was gunned down before he could reach his front door. Mothers carrying children were not spared, bullets found them in the chaos, and their cries pierced the night. It was a world where stepping outside meant risking your life, yet staying inside was just as deadly. For those trapped in their homes, fire became the enemy. Crowds set entire rows of houses ablaze, flames spreading from one wooden structure to the next. Families huddled inside, weighing impossible choices. Some tried to smother the flames with blankets and water, praying they could hold out. Others made desperate escapes, climbing through windows or pushing through doors as smoke filled their lungs. Many never made it out. Witnesses later spoke of fathers carrying children into the night, only to be struck down before they could reach safety. Whole families perished in the inferno, their cries lost to the roar of fire and the jeers of those who stood outside watching. Not all deaths came from flames or bullets. Some were beaten in the streets, cornered by groups who struck with fists, clubs, and whatever weapons they could find. Survivors recalled scenes of brutality that seemed unreal, men struck until they could no longer move, women attacked as they begged for mercy, even the elderly targeted without hesitation. In these moments, there was no regard for humanity, only violence carried out with chilling determination. The cruelty was compounded by its public nature. Some victims were lynched, their bodies displayed as warnings. Others were dragged through the streets, beaten until they no longer resembled the people they once were. These acts were not hidden in shadows, they were carried out in plain view, with onlookers gathering as though it were a spectacle. The violence was not only about taking lives, it was about sending a message, about stamping fear deep into the heart of a community. What made the situation even more horrifying was the absence of help. Authorities were either unwilling or unable to intervene. In some cases, their presence offered no protection at all. For those under attack, there was no safe place to turn. The people who should have defended them stood aside, and in some instances, joined the violence. That betrayal cut as deeply as the weapons themselves, leaving survivors with the knowledge that justice had abandoned them. Amid the destruction, small acts of courage did shine through. Some families risked their own safety to shelter neighbors, hiding them in basements or guiding them across dangerous streets. A few survivors remembered strangers who opened their doors, offering a chance to escape when all else seemed lost. These moments of humanity, though rare, showed that compassion had not been completely extinguished. Yet they were overwhelmed by the larger tide of hatred and fear. The death toll from that night is still uncertain, but the ways in which people died reveal the scale of the tragedy. To say that some were shot, some were beaten, and others burned alive is to summarize what cannot truly be captured in words. Each death carried its own story, each life cut short under circumstances that defy comprehension. The father who tried to shield his family. The child who never reached adulthood. The grandmother who should have lived out her years in peace but instead faced terror at the end. For survivors, the memories lingered for decades. They carried the images of neighbors lost to flames, of friends cut down in the streets, of loved ones who vanished into the chaos and were never seen again. Those memories were passed on to children and grandchildren, keeping alive not just the pain but also the truth of what happened. The massacre was not only about the destruction of buildings or the loss of property, it was about the violent erasure of lives and futures. The community that had been built through hard work and hope was left scarred, its people scattered, its promise diminished. The violence of that night was intended to destroy more than individuals, it was meant to crush an entire community's spirit. Yet, even in the face of such horror, resilience endured. Survivors rebuilt, carried on, and refused to let the story be erased. Their testimony stands as a reminder that behind every statistic are human lives, and behind every life is a story worth telling. The tragedy of East St. Louis in 1917 is not only about how people died, but about how their memory continues to call for recognition, for justice, and for the dignity that was denied them in their final moments. When the violence in East St. Louis erupted, the community looked instinctively toward those sworn to uphold order. In times of crisis, the presence of law enforcement is supposed to serve as a shield, a reminder that society is bound by laws, not chaos. But in July 1917, that shield was nowhere to be found. Instead of protection, black residents discovered a chilling reality: the very people entrusted with safeguarding the community often turned their backs, or worse, joined in the fury. As mobs stormed the streets, setting homes ablaze and attacking families, many believed help would come once the authorities arrived. Mothers clutching their children peered through windows, hoping to see uniformed officers restore peace. Fathers tried to hold their households together, whispering reassurances that the law would prevail. But when the whistles blew and the patrols appeared, relief quickly gave way to despair. In many cases, officers stood idly by, watching the destruction unfold as though they were mere spectators. The silence of inaction was as violent as the mobs themselves. Residents begged for help, pointing to the burning houses, the bloodied bodies, the chaos consuming their neighborhoods. Yet pleas fell on deaf ears. Some officers brushed people aside, refusing to intervene. Others directed their energies not against the attackers, but against the victims, detaining those who tried to defend themselves. The message was clear: the law was not neutral, and its absence was a weapon in its own right. Stories from that night reveal moments that still haunt descendants. Survivors recalled officers leaning on their batons, arms folded, as flames consumed entire streets. There were reports of officers laughing with members of the mob, their casual presence blurring the line between authority and aggression. For many black residents, it was a betrayal so profound that it reshaped their understanding of what it meant to live in America. If the law could not be trusted in the moment of greatest need, where could trust ever be placed? There were even instances where officers actively enabled the violence. Testimonies described police guiding mobs toward black neighborhoods, or ensuring that certain streets remained unguarded so that attackers could sweep in unopposed. Some survivors swore that shots fired into crowds came not only from vigilantes but from those in uniform. Such accounts revealed the grim possibility that the very institutions designed to maintain peace were complicit in destroying it. The sense of defenselessness was overwhelming. Families barricaded their doors, not knowing whether the next knock would come from a neighbor seeking safety or from intruders intent on harm. They had no hope of dialing for help, no expectation that patrol wagons would come to their aid. In those dark hours, survival depended solely on luck, ingenuity, or the kindness of a stranger. The protective arm of the state had withdrawn, leaving an entire community to face the storm alone. For those who lived through it, the betrayal cut deeper than the physical wounds of the riot. Fire could destroy homes, fists and bullets could shatter bodies. But the knowledge that justice itself had stood aside, that the law had chosen sides, left scars that could not be erased. This betrayal reinforced a painful truth: in East St. Louis, citizenship did not guarantee protection. Rights could be spoken of in principle, but when tested by violence, they dissolved like smoke. Generations later, the stories passed down retained this sense of disillusionment. Elders would recount how, when the city burned, those sworn to keep the peace turned a blind eye. They would describe the sight of officers laughing with the mob or refusing to act, ensuring that younger generations understood the depth of the injustice. The massacre was not only an episode of unchecked violence, it was also a revelation of how fragile justice could be when prejudice infected the very institutions meant to uphold it. And yet, even in the face of such abandonment, resilience emerged. Survivors carried their stories forward, refusing to let silence cover the complicity of law enforcement. Their testimony stands as a warning, echoing across time: when those entrusted with authority fail in their duty, the damage extends far beyond a single night. It erodes trust, fractures communities, and leaves behind a legacy of fear and anger that cannot easily be mended. The tragedy of East St. Louis in 1917 was not simply the violence of the mob, but the silence and participation of those who should have intervened. It was the realization that justice was not applied equally, that the scales of protection tipped heavily depending on the color of one's skin. For black residents, the night was not just about survival, it was about understanding, in the harshest way possible, that the law was not always their ally. In remembering these events, we acknowledge more than just the destruction wrought by fire and fists. We confront the deeper truth, that justice delayed or denied is itself a form of violence, and that silence in the face of injustice can be as devastating as the blows of a mob. The voices of survivors remind us that the failures of 1917 were not just personal tragedies, but collective ones, a wound carved into the very fabric of a nation that promised liberty and protection for all, yet delivered neither on that fateful night. In the aftermath of the violence, East St. Louis stood as a city transformed, its streets carrying the weight of silence where once there had been laughter, music, and the hum of daily life. Entire neighborhoods lay in ruins, the charred remains of homes marking the spaces where families had built lives with hope and determination. For many who survived, there was no question of staying. The city that had once promised opportunity had turned into a place of terror, and the only option left was to leave. The decision to flee was not taken lightly. These were families who had invested everything into East St. Louis. They had arrived from the south with dreams of a better life, taken jobs in the stockyards and factories, and built communities where children could grow and families could thrive. But the events of July 1917 stripped away not only their homes but also their sense of safety. In a city where their lives had been so brutally disregarded, remaining felt like waiting for the next attack. So, in great waves, people packed what little they could salvage and sought refuge elsewhere. The image of departure was heartbreaking. Families walked along railroad tracks, children in tow, carrying bundles of clothing and whatever valuables they could rescue from the ashes. Some boarded overcrowded trains heading north, unsure of where they would land but certain they could not stay. Others left on foot or in wagons, traveling miles under the summer sun, their faces marked by exhaustion and grief. It was an exodus born not of choice but of survival, and every step forward carried the weight of loss. For the city itself, the consequences were immediate. Streets once filled with vibrant life became empty. Businesses shuttered, not because of poor trade, but because their owners had either been killed or forced to abandon everything. Churches that had been the heart of the community fell silent, their congregations scattered. Schools, once filled with eager young students, sat half-empty as families sought new beginnings in safer places. The cultural fabric that black residents had woven into East St. Louis was torn apart almost overnight. The loss was not just physical but deeply emotional. Families leaving behind homes they had built with their own hands often looked back one last time, seeing nothing but smoke and rubble. Those who had buried loved ones during the chaos carried their grief with them, leaving the city not only as refugees but as mourners. Each departure was marked by sorrow, but also by resilience, a refusal to endure any longer in a place that had betrayed them so cruelly. For those who remained, the city felt hollow. Survivors spoke of walking through neighborhoods where every other house stood abandoned, windows shattered, doors hanging open. The emptiness served as a haunting reminder of the destruction, a landscape where community ties had been severed. Loneliness settled over East St. Louis like a second wave of devastation, making the silence almost as unbearable as the violence itself. Yet, in their departure, those who fled carried with them stories that would not be silenced. They took their experiences to new cities, Chicago, Detroit, and beyond, sharing with others what had happened in East St. Louis. Their movement northward became part of the larger Great Migration, a mass relocation that reshaped the demographics and culture of America. In their flight, they planted new roots, built new communities, and contributed to the growth of black cultural and political life in cities far from the Mississippi River. The devastation of East St. Louis, however, lingered. Property values collapsed, industries struggled to fill jobs, and the city's reputation was forever marked by the memory of bloodshed and fire. It was not just a physical wound but a moral one, a scar on the identity of a place that had once prided itself on opportunity. The absence of thousands of African Americans was felt in every corner of the city, from the quiet streets to the silence in once busy workplaces. Looking back, the flight from East St. Louis symbolized both destruction and endurance. It was a tragedy that so many were driven from their homes, but it was also a testament to the will to survive and begin again, even in the face of unimaginable loss. The people who left did not vanish, they carried their culture, their determination, and their resilience into new spaces, reshaping the future of Black America in the process. The exodus marked the end of an era for East St. Louis. A city that had once drawn families with promises of prosperity had instead pushed them away with fear and fire. But in leaving, those families did not surrender their dignity. They refused to remain trapped in a place that sought to erase them. Their departure was both an act of grief and an act of defiance, a way of saying that, even in devastation, they would endure, rebuild, and continue to seek a better life, even if it had to be elsewhere. When the fires in East St. Louis finally dimmed and the smoke cleared, the nation was left staring at the ashes, not only of homes and businesses, but of the illusion that America was united in progress. News of the massacre spread quickly, carried by newspapers and whispered in communities across the country. Photographs of burned-out streets and stories of families torn apart by violence appeared on front pages, shocking those who had not yet grasped the scale of what had happened. For many, the events were almost beyond belief. How could such brutality erupt in a city that had promised opportunity? How could neighbors turn on neighbors with such ferocity? The shock reverberated far beyond Illinois. In the halls of government, lawmakers debated what the tragedy revealed about the nation's character. Was it simply a failure of local leadership, or was it a symptom of something much deeper, a sickness woven into the fabric of society? Politicians were pressed to respond, and though some dismissed the massacre as an isolated outburst, others acknowledged it as a glaring sign of injustice that demanded attention. The conversations quickly broadened, spilling into questions about labor, migration, and the very meaning of equality. One of the loudest debates centered on the rights of workers. At its heart, the massacre was born out of fears of job competition, stoked by strikes and economic uncertainty. Labor unions, once seen as defenders of the common worker, found themselves under scrutiny. Could they truly claim to fight for fairness when their own ranks were fractured along racial lines? For many observers, East St. Louis exposed a painful contradiction. The call for solidarity among workers often excluded those whose skin was darker. The tragedy forced Americans to confront the uncomfortable truth that labor rights could not be fully realized without addressing the barriers of race. At the same time, the massacre intensified the conversation about race relations in America. African American leaders across the nation condemned not only the violence itself but also the complicity of authorities who had stood aside, or even joined in. Newspapers like the Chicago Defender demanded justice, refusing to let the story fade into obscurity. Voices rose from pulpits, meeting halls, and street corners, calling for the nation to reckon with its hypocrisy. How could America champion freedom abroad while ignoring the persecution of its own citizens at home? For many African Americans, the events of East St. Louis confirmed long-standing fears, that progress in the North was fragile and conditional, easily shattered by prejudice and resentment. Yet, rather than silencing them, the massacre gave strength to movements demanding change. Organizations like the NAACP used the tragedy as a rallying cry, holding marches and delivering fiery speeches that insisted on accountability. The violence in East St. Louis became more than a local disaster, it became a national symbol of the struggle for justice. Even those far removed from the city could not ignore the implications. In towns and cities across America, families sat at dinner tables discussing what had happened. Some spoke in hushed tones, horrified that such cruelty could take place. Others reacted defensively, unwilling to acknowledge the deeper issues at play. But in every conversation, the massacre forced a reckoning. Was America truly living up to its ideals of liberty and equality? Or was it a nation still bound by divisions too deep to ignore? The debates did not end quickly. In the months and years that followed, East St. Louis lingered in memory, often invoked in discussions of race, labor, and justice. It became a reference point for both reformers and critics, a grim reminder of what could happen when fear and hatred overpowered reason. Writers, activists, and politicians alike returned to the massacre as evidence that the nation could not afford to look away from its divisions any longer. Yet, even as the country debated, the survivors carried on, rebuilding their lives in the shadow of what they had lost. Their resilience stood as quiet testimony to the strength of a people too often overlooked in the very debates that their suffering had inspired. They were not merely victims, they were the living proof that, despite everything, the pursuit of dignity and justice could not be extinguished. The massacre of 1917 shocked the nation not only because of its brutality but because it laid bare the contradictions at the heart of American life. It exposed the fragility of justice, the limits of solidarity, and the urgency of change. In its wake, conversations about racism, labor rights, and fairness took on a sharper edge, pushing the nation closer to confronting truths it had long tried to ignore. Though decades have passed, the echoes of those debates remain. The story of East St. Louis is a reminder that moments of tragedy can ignite broader struggles for justice, forcing society to ask difficult questions. It is a story not just of loss, but of awakening, a painful turning point in the ongoing fight to make the promises of America real for everyone. The story of East St. Louis in 1917 did not end with the smoke clearing or the last family fleeing their burned-out home. Its legacy stretched far beyond the city's borders, leaving an imprint on the conscience of the nation. What happened there was not just an isolated moment of brutality, it became a symbol, a stark reminder of the dangers of unchecked hatred and the devastating consequences of indifference. The massacre forced America to look in the mirror and see, however briefly, the divisions it had long tried to conceal. For those who lived through it, the memories were etched into their very being. Survivors carried the weight of that night for the rest of their lives, their voices telling stories that could not be forgotten. Parents who escaped with their children passed down lessons of both caution and resilience, ensuring that future generations would understand not only the pain but also the strength that had allowed them to endure. In this way, the tragedy became part of a larger narrative, woven into the fabric of Black history and memory. But East St. Louis was more than memory. It was a catalyst. The horror of what took place awakened activists, writers, and leaders to the urgent need for change. Organizations such as the NAACP seized upon the tragedy, using it as proof that the struggle for equality was not abstract, but immediate and deadly. The massacre fueled marches, protests, and speeches across the country, inspiring a new determination to confront injustice wherever it appeared. Out of the ashes, a movement gained momentum, one that would grow, decades later, into the larger civil rights struggle that reshaped the nation. The symbolism of East St. Louis endures because it reveals both the worst and the best of humanity. It shows how fear and prejudice can spiral into destruction, but also how resilience and courage can rise from devastation. The massacre serves as a warning of what happens when a society fails to protect its most vulnerable, but it also stands as a reminder of the unbreakable will of those who refuse to be erased. Today, when we reflect on East St. Louis, we do so not only to mourn the lives lost but to honor the legacy of resistance it inspired. Each life taken, each family displaced, and each voice silenced became part of a larger call for justice, one that continues to echo through time. The city's tragedy is not merely a story of destruction, it is also a story of endurance, a story that reminds us why the pursuit of fairness and dignity must never cease. As the years have passed, the memory of East St. Louis remains a light in the shadows of history, a painful but necessary reminder of how far we have come, and how far we still have to go. It is a testament to the power of memory, the importance of truth, and the resilience of communities who refuse to let tragedy define them. If you found this story meaningful and believe it deserves to be remembered, I invite you to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share it with others who care about uncovering the hidden chapters of history. Your support keeps these voices alive. Thank you for watching, and may you rest well tonight. Good night.